Okay, so on Stitch Club today we're going to look at bias binding, and the bias binding specifically around a neck of a top and also around the armhole. I've got a few bits kind of semi-prepared so that we're not here for an age today. So bias binding, you can make your own or you can buy it ready done, and it has these two folds in it usually when you buy it. I will show in a separate video how to make bias binding. I've shown it before to some of the quilters, and usually in quilting you do it slightly differently, where you tend to fold it in half. So for example, the binding on the rainbow quilt, which wasn't cut on the bias, but very often in quilting you are using a binding and folding it in half as opposed to the two folds that you're getting here. But when you're machine finishing, the two folds are quite helpful, but I will show you in that video how to achieve this effect without necessarily one of those special little gadgets, although you can get them, and I'll see if I can find a link for those as well, because if you do a lot of dressmaking they'll probably be quite handy. But as I say, I will show you a little method of doing that. Okay, so the thing about bias binding, it's cut on the diagonal, and you can normally tell, oh, I haven't got a piece that's joined, let's find one, there we go, and it's cut on the cross. Okay, the bias, the 45-degree angle of the fabric, and that is what gives it its stretch, because any fabric, and I've been through this before and I will keep going through this again and again and again, when you cut on the grain of the fabric, the horizontal grain of the fabric, there should be very little stretch or no stretch. So the least stretch, unless obviously it's a stretch fabric. I'm talking about woven fabrics here. If you cut on the vertical grain, so going up as well, with a lot of woven fabrics, especially things like quilting cottons that this is, and that's one of the reasons why I like using them, especially for children's clothes, because the patterns, look at this, absolutely beautiful. It also means you can use far less fabric often, because you can cut, this is an all over design, so it doesn't have any kind of direction that I need to follow, and it means that I can cut on the horizontal grain, but I can also cut on the vertical grain as well. But when you go on the bias, which cuts across at a 45-degree angle, that is when you get a lot of stretch in a fabric, and you turn a fabric into a stretch fabric, even though it's a woven fabric. And I'll talk more about that in tomorrow's live feed as well, because I want to show you a hack on the top that we've been making. Okay, so what I have done around the neckband here, and like I say, I've sort of done half of it so we don't have to be here for an age. I have clipped it in place. Clips are quite good, because then it doesn't matter whether you're on the wrong side or the right side of the fabric. You don't need to move your pin heads and things around. And as I've clipped it, I'm going right side of the binding onto the wrong side of the fabric inside the neckband, and I'm stretching the bias, but I am not stretching the neck. And I'm hoping you can see here, in fact let's see if I can go in closer, there we go. I have already stay stitched along the neck, okay, and I have done that really close to the edge. I've moved my needle position right over to the right hand side, okay, so that I know when I now go around with the bias tape here that none of that stitching is going to show, because I'm now following this first crease with my stitching, and that is to the left hand side of my stay stitching. Okay, it's really important to stay stitch a neckband though, because that could easily stretch out, and although we want this to stretch, the bias to stretch, we don't want that to stretch, because that's how you end up with sometimes those slightly deformed necklines, or ones that aren't sitting flat enough. Very often it's because you haven't done this process. It seems like something that you can avoid or think, oh, it doesn't really matter, but like a lot of these things in sewing, those couple of minutes just to do that part of the process actually can make a big difference. So I've already started stitching around here, so I'm just going to finish clipping these bits just to show you what I'm doing. So as I say, I am pulling on the bias to stretch it, but I am not pulling on the underneath. And what you should see is, look, you can see there's a slight bagginess here on the actual dress part of it, the bodice, and that is kind of what you want, because what you want is enough pull in that bias to nicely roll over when you get to the end. I'm going to tuck that end piece under as if I'd finished that nicely. I've shown you already in a previous video how to finish that back piece. So again, look, I'm pulling it, but I'm leaving, the bias is getting pulled, but that isn't getting pulled, and then clip it. Sew it from the top with the bias, okay, but I want you to always keep in mind, and I'm going to shift back a bit here because I'm too close, I want you to always keep in mind what is going on underneath. Okay, so as you go along, do it in little bits. So if you've got a speed control, go on to a nice slow speed. There's no prizes for speed on this and getting there first. Okay, so nice and slow, and you're stitching into that first pressed line there. That's your guide, if you like. Okay. Oop, and I've immediately jumped over because I had my machine switched. It had gone into sleep and now it's moved. There we go. Thank you. Right, so I'm taking the clips out and I'm holding it, and I don't know if you can see, but I'm kind of giving it a little bit of a tug as I go through, and I'm just keeping an eye on what's going on underneath so that I don't get any pleats in it. So I can just keep pulling that bit up. See, that bit slid underneath, so I can pull that up. And slowly, so, you know, literally ½ inch, an inch at a time, and then go back in, check that you're catching both sides, because that's one of the things that is very easy to do with this, is that you miss a little bit. And because you're kind of wrangling the fabric, it's one of those processes where it is much easier to just do it a little bit at a time. If you don't feel confident with pins and clips and things like that, you could baste this all in place if that makes you feel a little bit more confident. And maybe the first few times out you might want to do that, just so that you feel happy that it's all going all right. But you can feel here what is going on. So I've lifted it up and look, this has slid down. So if I carried on sewing without looking there, I would have completely missed catching that part there. And what I'm going to do when I've finished is I'm going to go back in and check, because before we do the next part of the process, you want to check that you have actually caught all of that in. Okay, so again, I'm smoothing out underneath here and I'm going to run round. We're on the straight bit at the end here to the end, and I've got a little overlap on the end because we're going to tuck that in nice and neat to finish off the ends of the neckband. I'm going to show you the armhole as well because it's just slightly different. Okay, so look, you can already see that the fabric wants to curve. It's going, oh, hello, I want to swing over onto the front here. So it should be doing that. If it's not doing that, you haven't pulled your bias tight enough. Okay, but equally you don't want to pull your bias too tight. Oh, I thought I had a tuck in there. If you do go back in and you've got a tuck, this is what I mean. Before you do the next part of the process, you can get rid of those tucks by just undoing the stitching of what you've just done. So this first row of stitching, just undo either side, take it back about 1 centimetre, stretch out your bias and restitch it. Okay, that was actually just a crease in the fabric, but like I say, do all of that before you do the next part of the process. So before I go any further, where I had that, I'm going to get rid of That was where my needle had changed its position. How dare it? Okay, so this fabric isn't particularly thick, so I'm going to just go with that. If you're working with quite a thick fabric, then what you can do at this stage is trim this down so that you've got less bulk under your bias around the neckband. Okay, but look, you can see, and you should be able to see, that folding over really nicely and taking that shape. And again, I'm going to start clipping, and I'm going to start clipping from the center this time. Okay, and putting those clips on. And because we've done this stitch in the first crease here, then automatically it should be even around here, because you've done even Stevens as you go round. So this will automatically, should all sit so that you've got a nice neat binding here. So at the end, if I just show you what I do at the end, so that's overrun a little bit, so I'm going to grab some scissors and take that down very slightly because I don't need it to be quite that long. Before I fold that end bit over, I'm just going to tuck that in. As I say, I would have normally finished that, so I've got that tucked under, seamed or whatever on the end. So that gets tucked under, and then we fold the bias over. Just run my nail in there so that that's nice and neat at the end, and clip it. Okay, but look, you can see as we go round that that should all be curving over nicely. Okay, if you've got quite a deep, this isn't a particularly deep curve, but if you've got a very deep scoop or something like that, you might need to clip those curves. If a fabric isn't doing what you think it should be doing, then just go back in and clip it. One thing to be careful of, I'll take that one out of the way so I can show you, because you've got that first line of stitching, you need to make sure when this is coming over, it's covering that stitching, because we don't want to see that stitching. Okay, so if I hold it up closer, for example, that, I know it's pink and you can barely see it, but let's aim for the best we can. Hey, don't care how many clips you use as many as you want for this. And as I say, again, if you're not feeling confident with this process, at this point you could then tack it all into place with a hand stitch and a nice bright colour so that you can see what you're doing. And then when you go back in to sew, you then haven't got to worry about clips or pins or things like that, because I know sometimes it's just one extra thing to think about as you're going into the machine. Okay, so again, I'm at the end and I'm just going to trim off. I've got the tiniest scissors in the world there, but there we go. Tuck that under, fold that under. I'm going to leave those little bits hanging there because I can show you in a second what I would do with that as I'm sewing. I'm going to clip that there. Okay, so if I hold this up, 1,000 clips, well, slight exaggeration, but you know what I mean. Okay, and I'm just checking that that's all sitting right and neat, and yep, happy with that. I'm now going to go in and top stitch this down. Okay, and that's why you put that on the back first. Okay, in your head you're probably thinking, oh yeah, I'll go onto the front and go onto the back, but when you're top stitching, you always want to be top stitching on the front where you can see what you're doing, so you can make it as neat as possible. Okay, and to top stitch I am going to use and I'm hoping you can see what that says. It's a G foot on my Janome here, which is the blind hem foot. if you've got a different model, you might have a slightly different looking foot. It might have a white plastic bit and a little screw, and it moves in and out, but it will be called the blind hen foot. Okay, and it will tell you in the front of your manual if you've got it. If you don't have a blind hen foot, trust me, these are a really good foot to have. They are for hemming curtains and dresses and things like that, but I use this an awful lot for top stitching because it has this little lip on it here, and what that lip is going to do is it's going to run all the way around here, and it won't let me shift, if you like. I will know by positioning my needle, and I'm going to position my needle so that it sits right on the outside edge here, so that as it runs round, it's going to stitch literally a couple of millimeters in all the way around, and it will just give you the neatest top stitching. Okay, every time I'm watching Sewing Bee and they're top stitching, and I'm thinking, use your G foot, and I shout at the television quite a lot generally, but especially during Sewing Bee when they're all panicking. Okay, so I'm going to go in now. At this point, I've obviously got to remove that clip, or I'm not going to get in underneath. Line it all up, and now I need to move my needle, because at the moment the needle is going in the center position, and because the blind hen foot is designed to stitch along here and then move over onto the other side, I need to move my foot so it's actually over here. Okay, so I am going to get it up first, because otherwise it's, and I'm going to move the position. Very often on your machine settings, on your straight stitches, one of the stitches, your straight stitches, will give you the option of the far left hand side. Okay, and now when I drop my needle, I can see it's literally a couple of millimeters in. Okay, so I'm going to start, and then I'm just going to do a little back stitch, only one or two. Okay, and then go. If, depending on what fabric you're sewing with, if it's getting a little bit sticky at the front, then come in a little bit further, because it can be a bit lumpy if you're on thickish fabrics. Okay, come in a little bit further and start. You can always go back in and do those couple of little stitches by hand, because if the machine's not moving, you get that thing where it just stitches on the spot because it's going, ah, it's too thick, I don't like it. Okay, so the other thing with top stitching is I'm going to change my stitch length. At the moment I'm on 2.2, so I'm going to take that up to 3 just to make it longer, because generally speaking top stitching always looks better longer. And I'm going to start taking my clips off, and I'm then just going to gently let it walk round, and you can see that that lip is sitting right on the edge there. So what I'm doing is I'm going to keep an eye on what is going on underneath here. I'm going to keep an eye on that stitching so that it doesn't all move out of the way and suddenly reveal my stitching as I go along, and just keep this side sort of flat as we go. One of the other things about using that longer stitch, and often if I'm talking to you about stretch fabrics, I will tell you to lengthen your stitch when working with a stretch fabric, because it then gives the fabric a little bit more play on the cotton, if you like. If you use too small a stitch round here, again you might find that it's not sitting quite as flat because it's got too much stitching. It's just a little bit too close and intense, and it's not going to let that bias do what it should be doing by rolling over. So we're nearly at the end. If you feel like it's going off-piste, then lift with the needle down, always with the needle down, and just readjust. Just keep your eye on that lip on the foot. Now, as we're coming into the end here, I'm going to come in closer because I want you to see As we're coming into the end bit here, can you see there's a little bit of that bias is poking out? So I'm going to use my seam ripper to just tuck that under and out of the way and hold that as we stitch in. Seam rippers are brilliant for this. When you can't get your finger in, and I would highly recommend that you don't poke your finger under here too close to the needle. I've done it and trust me, it hurts. Use your seam ripper because you can take that almost to the end so that it's underneath, and by that stage it's kind of sorted itself out. And then I'm going to use my lock off to do the final little stitches on the end. There we go. But look, if I can get that out. There we go. Let's come back out again. So you can see, needs a press, but you can see how neat that top stitching is and how close to the end. Now if you tried to do that by eye, trust me, that would have been quite difficult. So that just needs a good press, and with steam preferably, and that's sitting really nicely, and you've got quite a neat finish on the back there as well where it join up. So if you were doing like a little loop, at that point when you're folding over that end, you could have put your little loop or your little bit of elastic in so that you can do your button on the other side, or you can do hook and eye or whatever. Okay, so just to talk through the process on the armhole. The armhole is done exactly the same pretty much, but obviously you have to join your bias up so you've got like a tube, if you like. So what I tend to do, and I've stitched most of this, but I haven't stitched the very last bit because I'm going to come back out. No, I am out, right, that's close. What I've done is I've pulled it round, and then I've pulled at that point I had a clip in there to match, but I've made sure that I am pulling both of these pieces of bias so they're not going to be they've got enough pull, if you like, to do that whole thing of rolling over that we want. And then I've just marked it with a friction pen where I want to sew it, and I've done the same on the other one. You can do like a little needle, a little finger press with your nail. For some reason this polycotton bias doesn't like that, but if I fold them back without pulling them, you can see, look, there's a gap there. What's that, ½ an inch? And that's what I want, because when I sew it together I want these to be tighty. Let's do it and show you. So I'm going to take that foot off and then find the other one, which, because it's the clear foot, generally speaking I can't find it because it's clear and it's hiding. Okay, so I'm just going to open these out so that I can match the two lines there of stitching. Usually when you join bias you join it on the diagonal, but when you're doing something this small, that frankly would be a little bit tricky, and there's not a huge bulk of fabric going on here, so I'm not going to worry about that. So I've pinned that. At that point I can take out a few clips. Give yourself enough oomph either side, if you like, so that you're not really fighting the whole thing going on here. So I can go in there and then just stitch down. Remember, I've moved my needle over. There we go. So stitch that across. Okay, and then trim away the excess with the smallest scissors in the world. And then I'm just going to finger press that open so that we can spread the load. And now if I stretch that out, you can see how that suddenly sits flat on there. So quick, put a clip there, and it's all clipped. So where had I stitched to? There we go. So if I go in here and finish off that stitching, so again I'm doing the same process where I am stitching in that first crease. Let's go back in close. I'm stitching in that first crease of the bias here, And yes, my needle, oh yeah, we're in the same place, good eye. And again, checking underneath to make sure that everything is fine and dandy. All this fabric wrangling that we do, I often think that it's a bit like dealing with fabric is like dealing with toddlers, isn't it? That we spend most of our time trying desperately to get the fabric to do something that it patently doesn't want to do, even though it's for its own good. So, you know, gently, sometimes take your time, be patient, and as I say, go gently. And then, you know, if all else fails, lose your temper and then throw it across the room. I mean the fabric, obviously, not the child. So there we go, that's done. And again, if I hold that out, look, you can see it's already kind of going in because it wants to. So once again, I can fold that over. I've used a friction pen there, so that marking will come out when I press it. I can fold that over exactly as we did on the neck, clip that all in place, and then top stitch round, once again using my blind hem foot. I mean, that's exciting. Some of you have probably had that foot in your sewing machine box for an age and never used it, but little did you know that it's going to become your new best friend. So I'm just clipping a few bits here, and I'm not going to show you that top stitching because we've done that, so I don't think we need to do that again. Okay, so if I just flip it round, but look, you can see that that's going to sit nicely and all curved. And the nice thing about this is that, you know, on this fabric, for example, how pretty does that look, that it's just picking out the colour. That's the only problem with shop bought bias, is you don't always get the choice of colour. But as I say, in a next video I will show you how to make your own bias binding, and sometimes it's really nice to have it pre-made for projects like this, because it can make a massive difference. If you've got a plain top and suddenly you put a little bit of Liberty binding around it, it can look lovely, and it's a good way of using small amounts of fabric as well. Okay,